Welcome to this conversation in the summit. And in this conversation, I'll be joined by Dr. Michelle McMurry Heath, who is the president and CEO of the Biotech Innovation Organization in the US. We'll also be joined by Nicholas Janni, who's a transformational coach and founder of the Leader as Healer programs. And what makes this a beautiful conversation is we're going to hear about Michelle's journey that she went through with Nicholas. Nicholas was her coach. So we'll hear about this deep transformational journey she went through and how race and gender were a part of that journey, and how Michelle now sees her role as a leader after going through this, and also what is Leader as Healer. So it's a rich conversation. Let's dive right in.
Thank you. So I lead an organization called the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, which is a coalition of 1,000 companies in the biotechnology space: food, environment, and healthcare. And I'm new to that role. I started on June 1st, but it has been quite a journey to get to what I felt my true gifts were, how I felt I could best offer those gifts up in service, and to find the right fit for those parameters. And that journey has been the almost 2 years now that I've been working with Nicholas. So it's been an amazing journey. And if I had to describe, well, maybe I should start with the fact that I think I actually started working with Nicholas a little bit by mistake. So I had told my corporate coach, I really need to work on presence. And what I meant was I need to be more authoritative in meetings. I need to be able to have that executive presence. And it took me a couple sessions with Nicholas to realize that his version of presence is something completely different, but so much more important and fundamental, and actually leads to my original concept, but through a circuitous path. But a very useful and helpful path. So, yeah, and the work that we've done is probably, I would summarize it by saying I had cut off various pieces of myself to fit into various molds that were required of me along the way. Some of those molds have to do with race. Some of those molds have to do with gender. Some of those molds have to do with what is corporate America or what is academic medicine. And that's all fine because it was required, or seemed required at the time. But when you come out the other end, if you can't reclaim those pieces of yourself, you're left hobbling out the door. So I think it's really a process of identifying where you cut off pieces of yourself and then slowly reintegrating them through meditation and reflection. And conversations is too reductive for what I do with Nicholas, but let's say conversation for want of a better word. And that makes you a whole person again. And it's impossible to lead with integrity without that wholeness.
Could you say something about like what the impact was of cutting those parts of you off? You know, you said like, yeah, there was these certain parts, like being a woman, my race.
Yeah.
Like, what was the result? Like,
so it's interesting. It's almost like making something palatable. I was very palatable. I was very acceptable, I think is the way to frame it. I could weather the daily indignities that were sometimes par for the course without making a fuss, without even seeming to react or flinch, which is also usually called for. But it meant that when I went home at night, in the days when we didn't all work at home, but when I went home at night, I couldn't process any of it. It just stayed at this very high frequency and level of creating, how do you even call it, reverberations and mini earthquakes in your psyche because you're not actually working it all through. It just kind of stays stuck. And you don't even realize you're doing it. 5 or 10 years into the process, you don't even realize that's what you're doing. But you become kind of disembodied because you're only able to kind of access your mental capacity, and almost everything else is deadened and not available as processing capacity.
You were saying before in the little check-in that was like almost like a protection, to not feel some of the experiences you were having.
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of minority and female leaders, and I think particularly for Black leaders, there are so many daily indignities that the only way you get back up again every day is to close those parts off. I mean, I still remember, so I was the first African-American to complete the MD PhD program at the university I attended. And I still remember being on the wards and having being completely torn down by a resident in a completely unnecessary situation, and retreating to the bathroom and crying and just looking myself in the mirror and saying, this is the last day you are going to cry at work. This is just the very last day. Now that's a conversation a lot of people have had with themselves along their paths. And it makes sense in a lot of ways. But if you get to the point where you can never cry, when you can never fully feel the impact of those blows, then you can't also navigate effectively through the world.
And what was the catalyst, if you could, maybe there wasn't one, but the catalyst for you to reach out to somebody? You ended up working with Nicholas.
It was a mistake. Yeah. I told you it was a mistake. I was tricked into it. Right. No, I mean, I was luckily in a corporation that really felt very strongly about coaching. And so every high-level executive was given a coach. I happened to find a lot of it meaningless. And then I was at an executive orientation session a year late because I was too busy to attend, with a colleague of Nicholas's, Michael Watkins, and he was generous enough to take me on as a coach. And so he helped me kind of as my corporate coach. And then I asked him this question. I said, I want to work next on executive presence. And then that brought me to Nicholas. I think if Nicholas had a website saying what he did, I probably never would have clicked on the website because I wasn't even in a place to comprehend the need or the impact. And that is really unfortunate.
I'd like to ask you about what he did. Yeah. But first, I think it would be interesting if you could say what the effect has been on your leadership, because I think that creates like a context and I feel like going in that way around. What's been the result of the work and the way you lead?
It's funny because I've been meeting my new team, my new organization that I lead, completely virtually, right? Because this is all happening in the context of COVID. And so you're trying to connect with people in this very odd way. But I have such an easier time connecting with people and also being able to sense what they're needing and how they move forward and how we create a co-led journey as an organization to move forward. And I will say that I am much more comfortable being vulnerable and talking about elements of my life story and trying to be very open and straightforward with the people I work with. And yet I feel less vulnerable than ever. It's a very strange paradox.
Yeah. Yeah. Less vulnerable in the sense of there's a strength in being comfortable with your vulnerability.
Well, meaning that when I bring in an element of my life story or when I am making those connections, I feel like I'm making a conscious choice about it. I feel like I am able to share and not do it reflexively, but do it purposefully. And at the same time, because I can integrate how my whole body is sensing the interaction, I am much less vulnerable to the psychic winds in the room. I mean, I think when you are processing everything from the neck up, and, you know, in science and medicine, there's a lot of that anyway. You're trying to figure it out like everything's a puzzle and a piece, and you're going to, you know, figure out the chess game, and you're going to make it work, and you're going to keep your eye on all the variables. But you miss so much because you have all of this intelligence in your body and in your spirit that you are closed to.
Mm. Yeah, I'd love to ask you, I want to talk about the work you did, and you're alluding to, you know, to parts of that, and we can bring Nicholas in, but maybe you could say something about how do you see your leadership now? Like what, you know, how do you hold what it is to be a leader? And even, you know, what you see as being necessary in the world around you, you know, in the organization you work in and the other organizations. Like, how do you hold what it is to be a leader in these times?
Well, it's interesting you use the word whole, because I do kind of feel like a vessel or a channel. Like I feel like I am being used for a purpose. That purpose is meaningful to me and hopefully to others. And part of my role is to be open to the signals and messages of filling the needs of the team that I work with and the broader society we're trying to serve. And it brings a kind of fearlessness about it. And it brings a flexibility that I didn't used to have in my leadership. And it alleviates a lot of stress and anxiety around being ready to do the next thing, picking the right next move, because you kind of have a confidence that things are happening as they should happen and in the time frame that they should happen. And when I forget that, I call Nicholas.
Yeah. Yeah, I just in general hear this story of like attuning, like reclaiming your body and being more attuned and available to receive what's around you in a way that doesn't knock you off, but then, you know, you can respond effectively or intelligently.
I still remember in the first few months of working with Nicholas when I started to notice that I would have chills down my spine. I mean, it's a very common reaction. Everyone, you know, can probably remember a time when they're having a conversation with someone or they hear something and it sends chills down their spine. I had not registered that reaction to anything in probably decades before that time. But that's a type of primal innate intelligence that is telling you something very important to how you see the world or move through the world that is almost impossible to live without. And yet I had so disembodied myself that I had forgotten that was even a reaction my body could have.
I have like one, I want to bring Nicholas in a moment, but just perhaps you could then just say like what the work is that you've been doing with Nicholas, you know, like, and maybe some of the super challenging moments or, you know, whatever feels comfortable to share, but like, yeah.
Well, I think part of it is fearlessly recounting how you've experienced the world, but not in a psychoanalytic way. It's really more about walking back through the experiences and stopping your mind and your words from categorizing them and framing them before your body's had a chance to fully react to them. And so I was in a yoga class the other day and we're working through an injury, and my yoga teacher said to me, you know, you learn all these automatic sets of movements in yoga, And sometimes what we have to do is just stop and slow down and move each muscle separately, so that you can untrain that coordination, that coordinated move, so that you can then find where the injury was and break it down and heal the muscle. And I think there's a lot about that. We have coordinated emotional responses that are off the shelf, that are indoctrinated and ingrained. And until you can start kind of picking them apart and figuring out how each emotional muscle is supposed to move separately, you can't even, work out the knots. You can't even get to the places where there's been an injury or something is stuck.
Yeah, nice.
I don't know, Nicholas, help me out here.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm going way out of my area of expertise.
but I think that's why I really appreciate you talking about this, because you're just saying it in your own words, the experience that you had, and I think that's very valuable. So yeah, but yeah, we can also bring Nicholas in, and perhaps you could just say something about how you've seen the work that you've been doing with Michelle, Nicholas, and I know we're going to talk about this idea of leader as healer as well. So yeah, sure. How do you see the work you've been doing?
Yes, thank you. First of all, it's really great to hear you speak about it, Michelle. And you touched already like many core points that I want to kind of articulate as clearly as possible. So my framework, it started, let's say 3 years ago, I wrote a paper called From Absence to Presence. And I coined this term cultures of absence. And you said, as you were speaking earlier now, you said it was like you got used to a certain kind of culture of absence. And in a culture of absence, the thinking, rational mind is the predominant modality, and our feeling and our sensing are way down. We process primarily through the thinking mind. But we normalize that. I think you said it perfectly. It's like we normalize it. So we don't realize that we're living in this very limited, basically non-feeling way. We don't feel the world. We have conversations, but we don't feel people. So I call that the culture of absence. And now see it even more clearly, and you, again, to pick up on what you said, as fragmentation. So like you said, during our work, you became aware that there are many parts that you'd excluded, which you had to, because they were very painful. And without going into detail, we worked through a lot of your early life and then your whole intergenerational imprint. Parts that you'd had to exclude, because that's what we do. It's too much. We learn to go forward in a way that functions for us. And in so doing, it's like a whole lot of us goes offline, to use a kind of appropriate method. It goes offline. Like I remember, I was thinking earlier, there was a really wonderful, I just remember once you came for a session and you'd just been at a big conference. I think it was many organizations. And you said, Nicholas, for the first time I noticed, no one is listening to anyone. I don't know if you remember that.
I do remember.
But it was a very important moment, because that breaks something. That's a wake up. It was a very significant step, because before that, you like everyone didn't notice that, because we're so in it. So,
and the important thing about that conference is that it was a conference of leaders.
Exactly. It was top leaders, I remember. And I remember you saying, I noticed someone would say something, but I saw it didn't land. So that was really wonderful, because it showed that your whole system, you were going through a reboot, let's say. Like, more, as you said it perfectly, whole parts of you are coming back online, which means that your attunement, as you said, expands exponentially. Because my thinking mind, as Einstein said, needs to be our tool, our servant, sorry, not our master. When it's our master, we forget that the thinking mind doesn't feel the world. It's not its purpose. It thinks about the world. But if that's our predominant modality, as you said, we don't feel the world. You lead a team, but you don't feel. And it was beautiful hearing you say that now you're tuned to the needs. So how does that happen? It's funny that you said it was by accident. You see, I recall telling you what we were going to do. I'm not sure I landed.
I just didn't understand.
And because what I've always said is that we're doing top-down and bottom-up work.
And I had no idea what you meant.
I know, but now you really know, because we've done so much. So the top-down is the meditative work. It's the subtle body work. It's all the yoga you do. And there was a very significant point in the journey where your meditation practice suddenly really landed and you were doing a lot more. That gradually rewires our whole nervous system.
Right.
That's one whole part of the work. The part of the work that I see and I believe is not so often done, because it's in a way much more difficult, and you've had extraordinary courage in how we've done it, is the bottom-up work. And that's where we look at all the parts that are hurt, scarred, wounded, very much on an emotional, visceral level. And we spend many, many sessions you called it having a conversation. And you said that doesn't really cover it. It doesn't really cover it. Because what we did was, and what you dared to do, and this is the really transformational part, is that you dared to tolerate the discomfort of feeling the parts of you that have been scarred, cast aside, not least through being a Black woman. And we're still doing that, because that's lifelong. That will never finish. That will never finish. And what we've done together is that we slowed down enough. I think it was lovely how you said it about the composition, because the mind goes very fast. So from the beginning, I said to you, we have to slow right down. We have to slow right down in order to notice what's happening physically, and most importantly, what's happening emotionally. And that's given us more and more access to all the parts that were offline. Otherwise, we can't access them with our thinking. We can talk about them, but it doesn't create change. Many people can analyze their childhood and so on, but it doesn't bring change. What we've done over and over is created the space to feel more. And the result of that, and I think you expressed how it's affecting you. The way I would put it is that it's a restoration of our base, our core ground. Because all of us in our developmental journey, in different ways, adapted to the world in such a way that we left our core ground. We left our base, more or less, over and over again. And then, as you said, it's like we're navigating the world, but we're kind of, not much of us is there. So the way I see all of the work and your whole presence now is it's so much, and you said it, you can be vulnerable, but also confident, because a whole part of the core base is getting more and more restored. And that's the only way we can then be coherent. Now we can maybe talk about your question, Joel, because unless there's a coherence like that, we can't see bigger pictures. We also can't be receptive to new ideas, because new ideas don't initially start in the mind. We always say the idea came to me, the idea came to me. So we have to be in a state of coherence where we can listen to more and more subtle dimensions. And that's why in a great team meeting, when everyone is more coherent, you will have these incredible conversations at the end of which you won't even know who had the idea. You know, it's like something is happening because the whole group is more mind, body, heart, present, connected. So that kind of branch, does that, Michelle, do you want to add anything to it?
It makes me think of two incredible pearls. Well, you have had so many incredible things that I take with me all the time, but there's two that come to mind as you're speaking. One is, I still remember, and we meet via Zoom, if anyone wonders. So that's like, so we're used to doing this work virtually, so it can be done virtually.
Yeah.
But you said you need to stop going like this and figure out how to go like this.
Right.
And I've demonstrated that to so many people, because I think you can feel how your breath goes up, you can feel how your shoulders go up, you can feel how your whole body is trying so hard to reach out.
Right.
And yet, until you go back and do this,
right.
You can't actually receive any of those things you're grasping for.
Right, exactly. That's something that, I mean, I've studied with some amazing people over the years. That was something from a 2-year Zen meditation training. And there were certain pearls, and he said, I'll never forget, he said, at any moment in our life, we're on a forward circle or a backward circle. And if we're on a forward circle, get off it. Because you said it perfectly. A forward circle takes us out. And then, interestingly, we might think we're relating, but we're not.
Right.
Because we can't listen like that. We can only listen when we come home, which is backwards.
Yeah.
There was a second one, yeah.
The other one, which was so transformative, was when I said, I don't have time to meditate. I mean, I have an 8-year-old daughter. I have, a global team. I'm flying all over the place. I'm barely sleeping. I don't have time to meditate. And I've heard this so many times from friends and other folks since then. And you said to me, when you take the time, there will be more time in your day. Not more time in your day, but more things will get done. You won't need the time you feel you're losing. That's not how you put it. You have a better way of saying it.
That's it.
But it's so true and so impossible. It's such a huge leap of faith to make, but you have got to make it, because you'll be chasing your tail. We have a new puppy, so I'm thinking about chasing your tail. You'll be chasing your tail forever, trying to find that extra 10 or 15 minutes of the day, until you get to that point where you realize, until you do this and until you take time to integrate and be coherent, and until you are able to absorb what's around you, you're not your most efficient. So for leaders who are worried about not being efficient, or this process not being efficient, I will tell you, it's an inefficient way to efficiency.
Right. Yeah, you said all the way through now in this dialogue, you said several times about embodied. That's one of the biggest transformational processes of all. Because in the culture of absence, in the culture of fragmentation, we're walking around more or less disembodied. Even if you go to a gym, you see people doing stuff to their body, which is not the same as being embodied.
Oh, yes.
And being embodied brings a whole different kind of inner rhythm. And I agree with you that we get more done, much more done, with much less effort and much quicker. It's very interesting. Mm-hmm. My mentor, Thomas Hugel, used to say, whenever we say, I don't have time, it's not about this, it's that we're not in an inner rhythm. Not in inner rhythm.
There's so many questions I could ask, but Nicholas, you were saying that as we do this work, this restorative work, the top-down and the bottom-up work, we're able to tune into, perhaps more subtlety or intuition, to read the space and feel what's here. Has that been the case for you, Michelle? Have you noticed? Have you found yourself as a leader not only that your presence and your, you mentioned this, you're in that backwards circle, you're not driven, but have you noticed also that, yeah, you find yourself more quickly intuiting what's happening or needed? And yeah, curious
Yeah,
about that.
it's interesting because I'm a daughter of a psychologist, and I always consider myself very good at reading the room and figuring out where people are coming from. But that's a mental process. And what I do now is it almost seems like haphazardly walk into exactly what people need instead of consciously analyzing them and figuring them out. So sometimes, the signal I get about what's going on or what's needed in the situation won't even make sense to me, but I'll just kind of follow it through, and I'll find out a day or two later that that was precisely what was needed at the point. Even if I was not clear on the reason why.
Beautiful,
that's really beautiful, because that's a wonderful expression of what a leader is healer. You're operating from a much bigger intelligence, let's say.
Yeah.
And in that intelligence, the one thing I've learned over the years, and particularly in recent years of training, is that we're in a multidimensional information field all the time. But when our thinking is the predominant modality, we only get a relatively small part of that information field. And we think that the more we analyze it, we're getting more information, and we're getting a very limited information. So in the bigger picture, by restoring our sensing body, our emotional body, and bringing mind, body, and heart into more coherence, we're opening such a big information field. And that's a radically different way to operate. It's radically different.
Yeah. I'll give you a very concrete example. So we were working on what our company was going to do on the day of George Floyd's funeral. And I was meditating that morning, and let me back up. A couple of days before, we were trying to figure out what were the logistics of the funeral. So if we needed to go dark during that period, we know exactly when it was. And I picked up my iPhone to Google it and found that he was being buried in the exact same cemetery my father was buried in. And decades ago. And I didn't know what to do with that information. It was kind of rumbling around in my head. I meditated the next morning, and I got up from there thinking, okay, you just need to write Dad's story. Just write it. Write how you think there's parallels or overlaps or what. I didn't know what it was going to be used for. I didn't seem to have a need for it. We were in the middle of this big press rollout. I didn't seem to have the time for it. I couldn't understand a logical reason why I needed to sit down and write 3 pages about my reaction to that. But I did. And then it turned out that we were doing this panel on race, and it made sense to actually start our parallel tweeting through the session with a tweet about my father and George Floyd having this parallel. And I went and found these amazing old pictures of my parents, including my mom with this beautiful, huge afro from the 70s. And that 3 pages of writing turned into a very short tweet, right, with the help of my team. But the response was so overwhelming. It was such a great stage for our panel on race that we were publicizing that day. And the response we got was so amazing from the public. But the response I also got internally from the team of being willing to share something like that also fit so perfectly, was so apt for the time. It basically said, they were raised in the same town. Today they're buried in the same cemetery. So much time has elapsed and so much progress has been made, but there's a lot farther to go. It was obviously a tweet, so it was shorter than that. But the response I got from the team was overwhelming. And so there's that synchronicity. There's that being open to the synchronicity. There's that being open to the detour that doesn't seem like it has a logical endpoint. And then there's the integrating of that information and process into what's needed in the leadership role. And then there's the reverberations that creates externally to the people you serve and internally to the people you lead. I always thought of myself as a healing type of leader before we worked together, because empathy came easy to me, sympathy came easy to me, and approachability came easy to me. But you don't realize you have no capacity to empathize and heal unless you're able to do this work. Yeah. So you can't follow through. You can have the promise, but you can't actually deliver.
I think when I hear about that kind of leadership, as opposed to a lot of the other kinds of leadership I see in the world right now, which doesn't seem to be having that kind of, impact of like almost enacting a new sense of meaning and possibility in the world. It's quite striking to me, and it's both emphasizes to me like where we've got so much work to do, but actually I feel a lot of hope too, like just in that, hearing that kind of vignette, and yeah, I wonder if this is a good time to talk a bit more about the leader as healer idea. And there is one thing I want to bookmark, which is, I think, having you two together. You mentioned this bottom-up work, this restorative work, and I'd love to get a sense of like, what does that look like, when you guys are together, like from both sides, yeah? But we can bookmark that.
Okay. No, can I speak to that?
You can speak to it now, yeah. We can go either way around, yeah.
It's exactly on my mind, so we're already synchronizing. Yeah, I think because I think this is so essential in leadership development. Let's take what seems like a very simple topic, but which again, Michelle, you had such a courage to face, which is the topic of internally where I do and don't feel safe. And we've had such deep process with that. So how does that work, Joel? It means that we meet like on Zoom and Michelle starts whatever she brings, but let's say we're clearly touching on that. And because I'm trained to be very attuned to what's happening in Michelle, I then may name, I think we're touching a territory here of safety. And I mean, it sounds simple, but it's obviously much more subtle than that. But then the key thing we do is that as coach, I make it safe enough for that unsafety to be felt. Mm-hmm. Because otherwise, everything like that we don't feel, and everyone is walking around with degrees of unsafety, sadness, whatever. But the degree to which those layers are not brought into contact, feeling contact, they're driving everything. Because our whole structure is set up not to feel that. So we're operating all the time in this part of us that is based on, I don't want to feel how unsafe I am. Mm. But when we make it possible together, which we've done many, many times with different topics, but to actually viscerally, that you've been willing to viscerally feel that in you. And sometimes we have to sit there and you tolerate the discomfort. You tolerate it, and I'm there, unconditionally there. Something really starts to happen deep in our system that we can never get to with thinking. It's a deep alchemical, sometimes I call it like the energy then metabolizes. All that frozen energy of unsafety, once we're willing to feel it, not to change it, not to heal it, but to feel it. Yeah. something metabolizes, and that's one of the reasons that your base got so strong now. I mean, your whole presence is so solid now. It's very powerful.
And one of the ways that happens is we'll recount something that in this case makes me feel unsafe.
Yes.
I will probably even be thinking, oh, it's not a big deal. It's not that important. I totally got it handled. What's the big deal? And I'll start to register a little bit on Nicholas's face, but also just from his energy, that something is landing that is more significant than my mental energy is allowing me to compute. And then it's like a dance. Then it comes back and I start to feel it in other parts of my body. And then I'm able to recognize, acknowledge the impact that it's had and feel where it touches me.
And that's where we've also, I'll just say as an amusing point that some of our deepest sessions, particularly recently, you start by saying, I don't think there's much to process today. And then 10 minutes later, we're like, boom.
Yeah.
But, what I wanted to say as well is that we also, of course, in that work, particularly with the topic of safety, we really touch into the intergenerational and the collective imprints that you as a person of color are carrying. You told me about how your grandmother wouldn't sit with her back to the door in a restaurant. And that's such a profound level of unsafety. And inevitably, that's come through to you. Inevitably. But if you would go through your whole life not feeling that, because it was too uncomfortable to feel that, you stay in that small part of you. Yeah. Highly functional intellectually, but not coherent.
And I don't know why, but the intergenerational piece was the hardest for my psychologically raised, scientifically trained mind to wrap itself around. Especially, all right, now we're going to get just really frank, especially it's very disorienting to have a white guy on Zoom tell you that you're not processing how you're feeling about race.
Right.
It's true. And there were a couple times I was just like, what? But Nicholas was thankfully very persistent and had walked this path many times with people, not just me. And I got there. But I actually think that the racial differences actually probably helped.
Yes. It's true.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. And I remember once you saying to me, I can't believe how deeply you see me. And I think I said to you, it's partly because I'm white.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same when I work in Israel. My wife, who's Israeli, has always said, you can work with us the way no Israeli can on the trauma here, because I'm not in it.
Right.
I mean, that's a whole other conversation. It's interesting.
And did you say why Michelle as well? Yeah.
It's not to say that minority coaches can't do this work, but it's just to say that some distinctions between the coach and the coachee are helpful, because there's less assumed understanding. There's less projected reactions.
That's also true. Yeah.
It's more blank slate.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I'm just wondering about the work needed, in terms of what's happening in the world right now, with black people, with white people, around intergenerational trauma, and the effects that could bring.
Well, I have an answer, but Michelle, you speak first. Go on.
I was just going to say that, Nicholas's work around the impact of racism on the trauma of racism on the people perpetrating as well as the people receiving is very eye-opening, but Nicholas, you could tell.
No, please. You have so much to say.
Okay.
So much to say, Rachel. Go ahead.
No, I think we haven't reached that point where everyone is realizing the pain that it causes on both sides. We are so busy seeing that there's winners and losers without realizing that it's all loss. And that's a bit unfortunate, because I actually think that everyone is going to need to, at least in the US, is going to need to work through how they've internalized race. And that is important work. But,
Yeah, and I would simply add to that that I think one of the main things that's needed is huge, very carefully held listening spaces, listening and feeling spaces. My daughter, who's obviously white, told me recently that her partner, he's works in a big advertising company, and he was on a Zoom call with 200 people, and he let her listen in. And on that call, only people of color were allowed to speak. Incredible, actually. And both of them told me they were in tears just listening. That's what needs to happen, but both ways. We need to really find the ways to listen and be deeply open and vulnerable and touched both ways. June told me amazing meetings he's having. This is an African-American CEO I also coach, where white people have also felt free enough to say to black people, this is part of how I feel and I see I'm racist, and felt able to be that honest. And when that's this mutual listening and receiving has got to happen in a bigger and bigger way. And it's much deeper than just venting, than just reacting. Sometimes we have to go through that, but until we reach the deeper pain, the deeper vulnerability, the deeper shame, the deeper hurt, and then I think the ground can start to get fertilized again, let's say.
And the important element about the story about your daughter is that both she and her partner were in tears, meaning that they had pain associated with these situations that they had not processed.
Exactly. It was like
people aren't realizing that they're carrying around that unprocessed pain.
Yeah, and they hadn't realized the degree to which people of color were so discriminated against and suffering. And they were deeply touched by that.
I'm just sensing, I know we have a few minutes left, and I'm just sensing where we go in this conversation. I think this topic we're on now is such a obviously profoundly important topic, and I'm also the idea of leader as healer. I think we could perhaps articulate more, and we've got a few minutes left, and there's some part of me that's wishing to invite both of you to speak to, what would you say to people listening, about what you learned, or what invitation might you make to people? What would you advocate for, knowing that, we don't know all the answers, and, we're speaking with humility, but I think you've both been through something that leaves you with something valuable to share in that way. So that was a kind of poor interviewing thing there. I just threw a bunch of stuff out, and I'll just see where you take it.
So I would say basically, we have to stop the old way of leadership. We have to stop the ego-driven, rational mind-driven, narcissistic, unattuned, unembodied leadership, because it's driving our whole culture towards a cliff edge, without a doubt. And we have to create this possibility that many people listening and on the speakers know, and leaders like Michelle have the courage to do. It's really difficult inner transformational work in order to become leaders who create coherence because they are more coherent, and create cultures where people feel more connected and therefore contribute with a lot more energy. And lastly, maybe just say as well, we need to also think this is not about not using power, but it's about using a scalpel rather than a blunt sword that most leaders walk around with. It's using a very precise scalpel for where things need to be excised. That's all part of leader as healer as well, but it's done with love, and it's done with a profound connection to the greater well-being.
And I would only add that, the universe is telling us to sit down and shut up. I mean, it's telling everyone to go inside, take the time, and reflect. And we have this BioGenius Award to high school students in STEM that are excelling. And I had a Zoom call with all of them at once. And the thing I left them with, the thing that made them nod their heads the most, was I just told them, realize that do what you're passionate about, but realize that you are going to have barriers. You're going to hit the wall. You're going to have things that just don't work out. It happens to everyone. And when that happens, give yourself the time to feel it. Go in your room, shut the door, and cry for as long as you need to. And then when you're ready to stand up and walk out of the door again, you'll be ready to take on the world. And I think just giving our young people the relief to know that it's okay to mess up or to hit an immovable object because it can't be avoided, and it's important opportunity to open.
It moves me to say, Michelle, that it's extraordinary working with you.
Oh, thank you. It's been life-changing working with you.
It touches me to the very core, how we work so deeply together. And
it's been an amazing journey.
To witness what you're doing now, and knowing how much you've been through and everything. It's a real privilege to accompany you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicholas. You're a brave accompanier, and that's probably, if I were going to describe what Nicholas does, I would probably describe it most aptly that way. But it's so much more than that. But that is definitely a huge part of it.
I'm very appreciative of both of you being willing to come in, and Michelle, for you to speak so vulnerably about your experience of being coached and your leadership. And I think it's immensely valuable because, I said before, we always hear from the coaches and the thought leaders, but just to hear from people actually leading in the field, I think it's fantastic. So thank you so much. And